Cool. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I've been part of the DAA for a long time now, so I'm always excited to speak at DAA events. You're all seeing, I assume, my full screen, correct? In presentation mode, everything looking good?
Yes, full screen.
Okay, cool. So today I wanted to talk about a topic that I've actually been chatting with folks about over a long period of time. Those who know me know that I spend a lot of time talking about analytics implementation. And the reason is, if you look at my background, I've spent about 20 years now in the analytics space. I was I kind of, like most of you, I fell kind of backwards into the digital analytics space. I was running the website for a local financial firm in Chicago where I live called the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And we had a website in the early 2000s, and none of us could figure out why we actually had a website and what it was there for. And then we decided to start using web analytics and just kind of fell in love with the technology and the field because I was a finance major in college. I ended up being one of the first customers of a little known startup no one had ever heard of called Omniture, and liked the product so much that I ended up joining and was one of the early employees. And I helped kind of grow the consulting practice in the US and over in Europe. After I worked at Omniture, I ended up running the analytics program at Salesforce.com, and then I've done consulting for many, many years on the product. Those of you who are in the Adobe world probably know me because I wrote the book for Adobe on Adobe Analytics. And recently I joined Search Discovery, and I work on this product we are creating called Apollo. But the main thing I wanted to bring up is that I've been through probably more analytics implementations than pretty much anyone on the planet, just because of certain roles that I had, especially when I worked at Omniture, which has given me a really interesting vantage point to understand kind of what people are doing right and what they're doing wrong. And I hope that that gives me enough credibility to kind of talk to you about why I think the way we've been doing implementations for analytics is basically wrong for the last 20 years. Now, the way I know that is, I always like to start with this story. When I worked at Omniture, one of the roles that I had was I was kind of known as the wolf character at Omniture. For those of you who aren't familiar who the wolf is, if you haven't seen the wonderful movie Pulp Fiction, Harvey Keitel plays a character called the wolf, and his job is to go in and fix situations when they get really, really screwed up. And one of the roles that I had when I worked at Omniture was basically to save accounts that had gone astray or done something really wrong. And because of that, I learned all the ways the companies out there tend to screw up implementations of analytics. Now, it happened to be on the Omniture/Adobe side, but I'm 99% sure that the same problems I ran into are also present on Google and other Heap and other tools as well. And so after seeing so many people screw up their analytics, I started to see patterns of what was happening and why people were screwing it up. And a lot of it came down to the implementation and the process that people went through for the implementation. So tonight, what I'm going to do is I want to explain 3 reasons why I think the way that people have been doing analytics implementations for the last 20 years is wrong. And I'm going to propose what I think is the right way going forward in the future. Now, I want to dispel any rumors before we get too far into this. I am working on a software product that I do think solves some of these problems, but I'm not here to give a sales pitch. I'm not here to push a product. I'm only building a product because I'm so passionate about the problems that we're facing as an industry. And I think that the implementation process really can be an existential threat for our industry if we don't kind of turn things around and do things in a different way. So I'm not going to be talking about product. I'm really going to be talking about the problem and the solution. So let's get into the first problem. The first problem that I believe is causing strife in our industry is that the overall process of managing or an implementation or doing even an initial implementation or re-implementation hasn't changed much in 20 years. Now, there's been one slight advancement, and that is in the field of tag management, where tag management vendors did kind of stop us from DOM scraping and doing hard coding tags, and they definitely expedited and put some order around some of the tagging. But beyond that, the general process hasn't changed since my first implementation in the early 2000s. And if you think about when I first did my first Omniture implementation, what was going on 20 years ago? Well, Friendster was the huge social media site of the day, starting to get competition by this company called MySpace. And LinkedIn had just started. And if you were really rich, you were rocking the Nokia cell phone that you see here. And so you can imagine that we've obviously come a long way in 20 years, but we haven't when it comes to analytics implementations. So let's go through what is the process that it's been for 20 years for all of you to try to think about implementing analytics. Well, the first step is that you pick a tool. Usually you pick an analytics vendor. There is a pretty big market share. If you combine Adobe Analytics and Google Analytics in our field, I think that makes up something like 95%, but there's other vendors like Heap and Snowplow out there. But when you get a tool, unfortunately, you don't actually get much when you get a tool. If you just put the base code on your site, you might get, URLs, you may get refers, you get page views, visits, and so on. But most of what you're going to do is not done out of the box. And it's kind of like an analogy I like to give people who, like my friends and family, when they ask what I do for a living. I'm like, well, I help people with analytics tools because it's almost like if you wanted to build a house and you hired you basically said, here's a contractor who's going to build the house, and the contractor showed up and just gave you a bunch of wood and a bunch of tools and basically said, good luck, go build that house, I hope it all works out for you. Without being too facetious, that's kind of what analytics vendors do, is they just give you a tool and they hope that you're going to know what you're doing. And of course, many people don't. And I look at this whole process as one of risk, and where are the places that people are at risk of making mistakes and kind of going astray. The first one is that they get a tool and they don't really think about how they should implement that tool. And I call this the tag first, ask questions later approach, which is let's just tag everything and hope that our poor digital analysts can figure out what they're going to do with our implementation. And that's your first risk point. If you do that, you're probably going to end up with some problems because you're probably not going to get everything you need and so on. So instead of that, one way you could mitigate that risk, and this is something that I've kind of advocated for a long time, is thinking about things more in terms of business requirements or business questions. And those of you who ever read my blogs know that what I like to do with clients and recommend for people out there is that before you do one line of code, you think about what are the business questions that you're trying to solve. Why are you spending money on Adobe Analytics or Google Analytics or Snowplow? And what are the questions you hope you're going to be able to answer? Now, for those of you who like this topic, if you have your phone handy, you can point your phone at this QR code, or you'll get these slides later. I basically did a whole presentation a week or two ago just about this one slide, why I think business requirements are so important and why they're critical to your implementation. But I think this is a way to mitigate risk, to make sure that you're minimizing the chances that after you're done implementing, all of a sudden people are going to ask you for things that you didn't think about ahead of time and get yourself in real trouble. Now, if I asked most of you to email me right now a list of all of the business requirements or business questions that are driving your analytics implementation, I would imagine that most of you wouldn't have that handy and wouldn't be able to easily send that to me unless maybe you're a past client of mine, because I would force you to do that. But this is something that a lot of people skip, and it's something I think is really important in the process. Now, once you have business questions, or if you skip that step, the next step in the process is the dreaded solution design document. This is what most people think is the end-all be-all of implementations and documentation, but this is a terrible thing to use to document your implementation. Literally, it's a document that says, here's all the data that we're collecting and which variables they're in our analytics tool. It tells you what you have, but it doesn't tell you why. The other thing that's difficult is it assumes that you know enough about your analytics tool to correctly architect a solution for all the business questions you have and create a really robust solution design. But I've seen over and over again that many people do not have those skills and that they don't know their analytics products well enough to be able to do that. So if that's the case, then what happens is then you have to go out and you have to hire either really expensive people to work at your company, because if they're certified, they're probably going to cost you some money, or you have to pay expensive consultants like me and other consultants out there to come and help you to figure out how do you turn your solution design or your business questions into a solution design so that you can actually get your implementation. And so if you don't know how to use your tool well enough, and if you don't have budget to hire outside people or really expensive employees who are certified, then that's another risk factor where you could break down and ruin your implementation. But let's assume that somehow you get past that, whether it's good or bad. Then the next step is you need to actually do some documentation. And this is where you have to write a data layer and you have to write tagging specs. And this has to be done perfectly because it has to line up with all of the data that you have in your solution design and all of the variables in your implementation. This takes a long time to build, and a lot of times people don't know the right way to do it. Should they do a regular data layer, an event-driven data layer, and so on? Again, a lot of expertise is needed, and this is a huge point where I see people fall down. And they either don't do it correctly, or they say, you know what, we're just going to DOM scrape it, or we're going to do something that ultimately ends up breaking. Now, once you get past that, then you've got to set up your tag management system. And that can take 30 days, 60 days, and you have to make sure you set everything up perfectly so it lines up with your variables, your data layer, your solution design, everything. And this is a pretty painful process, and depends on which tag management system you use, but you're not done yet. After that, you have to go into your analytics tool, and then you have to not only kind of configure it to allocate all of your variables, but you have to make sure you get every single setting right for every variable. Because if you don't get the right settings, then all your data could be wrong too. So you've got a risk point at the data documentation, data layer. You've got a risk point at your tag management system. And then you got another risk point if you don't set up your variables and settings correctly. If you make it here, then you finally get to the point where you can tag. And here, this is where you got to hope and pray that you have resources available to you to do the development. You've got to hope that your developers populate the data layer correctly and that they understand what they're doing and so on. So at this point, you're just at the tagging point. Then after tagging is done, then you want to make sure the data is correct. And a lot of people skip this step, but you want to validate the data and you want to make sure all the data that's coming in is really good. And this could be done manually, or you might use like third-party tools like Observe Point and other tools out there to basically check your data quality and make sure your data is right. But again, another risk point where things could go wrong. Once you make it past this, then you've got to create your reports and dashboards and hope you create them correctly and make sure that all your users understand how to use them and educate them on that. You might have to also create some calculated metrics or conversion metrics so people can start looking at ratios and seeing how things are converting. And then you might want to create some segments so that you can slice and dice your information by different groups of people or different audiences and so on. So as you can see, that's a pretty painful process. And what's kind of funny is we're so used to this process that we don't even think twice about it. But as I was going through those slides, I was purposely trying to make you annoyed and make you feel like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is what we go through all the time. As you saw, a lot of that stuff is pretty tedious. And the worst part about the whole thing is that after you make it through all that, there's even more bad news. Every time a new business question gets asked from your organization, you have to go through that same exact process again in a mini version. So for example, let's say someone in your company says, hey, I want to track visitor engagement on our website. I read a blog post by Adam Greco. Well, then you have to that's a new question that needs a new solution design, that needs new variables, that needs new data layer, new tagging specs, new tag management setup. Then you've got to QA the data, get your developers populated, all that stuff, create reports, dashboards, and it never, ever ends. You have to go through this brutal, brutal process. And again, as I said, I look at everything as a risk management perspective. Where are you at risk that those things could drop off at any point in time and you can end up with a bad implementation? So if you think about this really archaic process, the questions that I would have you ask yourselves are, and these are the questions I hear a lot from people, are you using an implementation that you inherited? Oftentimes you're stuck with an implementation that you didn't architect. Someone did it way before you. They're not at the company anymore. And are you confident that the team that built that is any good? We also, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies don't have well thought out business requirements or business questions that they've thought of ahead of time, that they've prioritized, and they've gotten approved by stakeholders. That is a key ingredient to really being successful to mitigate your risk. The other thing is not to like cast aspersions on your team or your consultants that you might be using, but how many implementations have they been through? Have they been through one or two, or have they been through 20 or 30? Because if they've only been through a couple of implementations, then they may not be qualified to do the right, correct solution designs to answer business questions. And that can be not only your internal team, but also your consultants if you hire outside consultants. I've seen many consulting firms that have pretty junior people who claim to know a lot, but they actually haven't been through that many implementations themselves. And how much time is your team spending on solution designing, data layer, tagging specifications, doing QA versus actually leveraging the data? I hear a lot of companies say they feel like they spend so much time on implementation and so little time actually using the data. And a key question that I ask people is, how long does it take for you to go from a question you hear in a meeting to getting data to answer that question? Many companies tell us that that's actually months. And that means your program isn't agile enough to really keep up with the business. And at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, do you think you're getting all that you can out of your digital analytics implementation? And if you look at your implementation and your team, what is the overall ROI? And so all of these questions, I think, point out the fact that that process that I just walked through is pretty broken because it's time consuming and is really difficult. And you have to ask yourself, is this really the best that we can do? So that's the first problem that I see, is just the overall process. Now, building on that is what I call problem number two, is that the implementation management process of managing implementation is really manual and it's disconnected. Now, in terms of all of those steps we just went through, think about how many man hours have to be spent on those tasks. Writing solution designs or paying consultants in their hours to spend on that. Writing a data layer, writing tagging specs, manually configuring every single step in your tag management system, configuring every variable in your analytics tool, the time of your developers, and so on. It's pretty brutal how much work goes in, and that's why an initial implementation can take months, and even making updates to implementations can take weeks or months. And part of the reason is because all of the different steps are completely disconnected from each other. For example, if you add a new business requirement, there's nothing that automatically allocates variables for you or automatically builds a data layer for you, and so on. All of those different steps are disconnected, which is not really ideal. Because when processes are disconnected and when they're manual and when they're complex, what that means is that your overall analytics program loses credibility and loses relevance. If you make any mistakes on the 6 or 7 steps that I went through in the beginning in terms of the solution design and so on, if you make any mistakes there, your team is going to think your analytics program isn't very good. If the data quality isn't good, you're going to lose credibility. But more importantly, if it takes you 6 months to go from someone telling you there's a new question they want to answer to being able to answer it, then they're going to give up on your team and they're going to go back to trusting their gut. But why should all this be disconnected? If you think about an analytics implementation, what does it really look like if you look at it from a skeleton standpoint? Well, if you're doing it right, you should be starting with business requirements, as I mentioned, but business requirements really can be broken down into a couple elements. There's the data layer event, like the action that happens on your website, like a form view or a form complete. And that's something a developer would set. And then within the data layer event, there's events and attributes. It depends on which vendor you use. They call it success events and EVARs, or if you're Google, it calls it something else. But think of that as what are the metrics and the dimensions that we want to capture. And if you bring all three of those things together, that really does become your solution design. But all of this is integrated because your events and attributes ultimately are farmed out to your analytics tool where they become variables like success events and EVARs or dimensions and goals. And those are configured in your analytics tool. So you can draw a line all the way from an analytics, like an EVAR, through an event to the business requirement. And then once you have your variable set up, the other thing you can do with your events and attributes is those are what are the building blocks for your data layer and your tagging specs and for your tag management configuration. It's not like that's done in a vacuum. You're basically taking the data layer events and modeling that in tagging and in the data layer and in a tag management configuration, making sure all the events and attributes are going to be correctly populated. Once you have that set up, then your developers actually do the tagging, and then you do QA, data validation, to make sure that it's correct. Now, once you're checking out your data, your real goal there is to make sure that you believe the data so that you can go back and you could answer the business requirements. And so you've kind of done a little circle here to say, I've got these events and attributes that I'm tagging so that I can then populate, I can check the QA, and now I can actually answer the business requirements. But in order to answer the business requirements, you have to go back to your analytics tool, go back to those variables where you create reports, dashboards, calculated metrics, and segments. And then those are what you use to answer the detailed questions that you had in your business requirements. And then lastly, if you're doing a good job, you will then train people on how to actually use your implementation and how to answer not specific things, but how to answer your business requirements. So as you can see here, everything is kind of interrelated. But what do we do today? And what have we done for the last 20 years? This is how we manage implementations of digital analytics today. If we have business requirements, and that's a big if, we have them in a spreadsheet. We have a solution design in a spreadsheet. We have tagging specs and data layer in maybe a Word document or a text document. Then we have a tag management system that we have to set up. Then we might have a QA system that we have to set up, totally separate. And then we have the analytics portion of our tool, which is totally separate. And then finally, we do our reports and segments and metrics in the analytics tool itself. But as you can see, this is kind of like a hodgepodge of different elements. And it's really hard to understand where your implementation is at, and it's not truly integrated so that you can't bring it all together. What you'd really want is a process that as you add a business requirement, all of these other things be managed in one place and they would all be dynamically generated. But that's the second problem, is just how manual and disconnected it is. And then the third problem is the fact that all implementations are custom. This is something that has bugged me way back to my early days at Omniture. I tried to change it, but I got shot down. But basically, every company has a custom analytics implementation. You may think that you have the best implementation in the world. That's your opinion. You can have someone judge that. But the truth is, if Adobe has 5,000 customers, then all 5,000 have different implementations. Same thing for Google. And that's not ideal, especially when many companies even have different implementations within one company. Many of you, if you're an Adobe customer, and I'm sure the same thing is out there for Google, have ever seen this kind of screen of death, which I call the multiple madness screen, which is where you look at a couple implementations of analytics, even within one company, and you compare them, and they're doing completely different things within the same company. So if you can't even keep it straight in one company, imagine the fact that every company out there has a different custom implementation. And it doesn't have to be this way. One project I did many years ago was for a company called Reed Elsevier. And I'll tell you an interesting story about this. They had about 70 different companies that were all under one umbrella, and they basically had 70 different Adobe Analytics implementations. And I went in and I said, you really should have one standard implementation across everything at Reed Elsevier. And they fought me. They said, no way, that's impossible. We'll never be able to do it. So what I did is I did a requirements gathering session, and I went to one site and I got every requirement I possibly could. And we got maybe 50 requirements. Then the next site I went to and interviewed them, and we basically ended up with about 60 requirements. And they had the same 50 requirements as the first group. They just had a couple extra ones. Then we went to the third group, fourth group, and fifth group. And as you can imagine, by the time we hit the fifth group, we ended up with about a total of 100 requirements or so. And they were pretty darn similar between all of the different groups. Now, not every website wanted to do all 100 requirements, but most of the sites were doing about 70 to 80% of the standard set of requirements. And the dirty little secret that Adobe and Google won't tell you, and no consultant will tell you except me, because I'm old and I don't care anymore because I'm going to be retiring in a couple of years, is that the truth is about 75% of all analytics implementations are the same. You can hire consultant A, consultant B, they're going to come in and they're going to give you about 75% of the same implementation that they've done for hundreds of other companies, because retail websites are very similar. Financial services are very similar. And even across verticals, they tend to be similar. They have similar attributes like content, pages, internal search, cross-sell, and so on. So there's really no reason for every company to have a custom implementation out there. But what happens if you live in a custom world? I'll tell you a little story about this, and I'll start with a funny little picture here. So this is me. I can't tell what year. I probably was about 10 years old here, Christmas time. And ever since I was a young kid, I had this fascination with cars, and I was really infatuated with the Chevrolet Corvette. I always thought it was the coolest car. So my dream was one day to have a Corvette, like an old style Corvette, but I wanted one that actually worked. So I did have one when I was younger. It ended up breaking all the time. I had to sell it. So a couple of years ago, I decided to build this beauty that you see here. This is a 1962 Corvette, but it's a resto mod that was completely hand built with all updated parts. So it acts like a new car, but it's actually, it looks like an old car. And I can tell you firsthand experience, this was a pain in the ass to create. Took about 3 years, took an amount of money that my wife and I don't like to talk about, and it almost caused a divorce on multiple situations. And the reason why is because everything in this car was custom. It's non-repeatable. It wasn't modular. If something broke, they had to go find something special. There were really no best practices. It was kind of like make it up as you go along because all the parts didn't go together. There was definitely no economies of scale. And I could tell you, having been stranded on the side of the road when something breaks, it is difficult to support and it's very expensive because you got to find a really knowledgeable mechanic. Now, the truth is I would never try to build this car by hand because I'm not handy enough to know cars. But the truth is that all of us out there are out there building custom cars today. We're just doing it with our analytics implementations. Now, some of you may be better mechanics than others, but none of you are probably as good of mechanics that you think you can build the world's best custom car yourself. And in fact, when I audit analytics implementations, everyone thinks they have this car, but the truth is this is more of what they have. I've done a lot of audits in my time, and usually on a scale of 1 to 10, people get about a 5 average score, because they think that they have the best implementation, but they don't. And there's a reason why people don't use custom cars like the one that I just showed you. Most people use cars that come from an assembly line, probably 99.9%. And why is that? Because assembly lines are more customized and more standardized. They're consistent. You can get them really quickly. It doesn't take 3 years to get a Toyota. They're definitely cheaper. And they can interchange parts, and there's a lot of reusability there. And they've built in best practices. After building hundreds of thousands of cars, they know what works. And if they find something that's better, they can then apply it to all the cars going forward. So there's tons of economies of scale. But we haven't yet done this in the digital analytics industry. All of you out there are playing around with custom implementations, and honestly, you don't know how good or bad they are. Now, when I was in the early days of Omniture, we tried to fix this problem by building this thing called Omniture Fusion Playbooks. The idea was that we would write a Word document that said, here are the 12 things that you should do if you want to track external campaigns, or you're a retailer. And we tried to come up with some standard implementations for all Omniture customers, but it just became really difficult because at the time Omniture was growing so fast that we had to really crank through implementations, and we didn't take the time. And what happened is I ended up turning into the wolf and having to go deal with lots of bad implementations. And so that's why my third point is that I think we just can't keep going down this path of having every company have different implementations. So first problem was that we basically have a broken process. The second problem is that the steps are manual and they're not interconnected. And the third problem is that we are all living with custom implementations like custom cars that really is not ideal or scalable. So what I think the future is going to be, and again, I admittedly a little biased because I am working on a product in this area, but I do think that analytics management systems will be the wave of the future. And I'll tell you why. But first, what is an analytics management system? I believe that there will be many analytics management systems in the future, but the idea will be that it's an integrated platform that manages all aspects of your implementation. One place that has everything there, and that it's integrated in a relational way so that you could end up with a better quality implementation that gives you more value and reduces the amount of time and effort that you need to manage your implementation. So what would be in an analytics management system? And I'll show you a little bit of what we have in the one that we're building, but again, this is not meant to be a commercial. First of all, I believe that the day of all of us trying to figure out what business questions can be solved out of thin air is crazy. You don't know what you don't know. You've only been through a couple implementations. But why not have an analytics management system that has thousands of business questions that have been proven to be done in years, over the last 20 years, and let you pick, like a menu at a restaurant, which business questions you want to be able to answer and be able to slice and dice by your vertical, by the different features you have on your website. I can tell you that as a consultant, I would go into client after client, and I had in my head all of the business requirements I knew that they needed, and I would just regurgitate the same ones. But they had to pay me for that. You shouldn't have to pay for that. You should be able to basically just pick, these are the questions that we think we want to answer. And whenever you pick a business question, you shouldn't have to know everything about Google Analytics or Snowplow or Adobe Analytics. You should have an analytics management system that has baked into it what is the best practice solution to answer that question, regardless of what analytics vendor you use. It should be vendor agnostic, and you should be able to just check off the business question and know that behind the scenes, the correct events, attributes, and data layer events you need are automatically added to your implementation. Now, after that, you shouldn't have to write a data layer and tagging specs or pay someone to do that. You should just have the analytics management system automatically write the tagging specs and data layer for you based on the business requirements that you've selected, because that's just, rote manual labor that doesn't need to be done. Then once you have your data layer and your tagging specs, nowadays tag management systems have been built with APIs. So you should have an analytics management system that can automatically build out your complete tag management setup for you. So as you kind of see on the screen here, when we go back into the analytics management system here, you should be able to just push a button and have everything that you need to answer the business requirements that you're looking for automatically set up for you, and have it totally customized to the data layer, the tagging specs, and all of the variables that you've outlined in your implementation. At the same time, you shouldn't have to be manually checking the data quality on your implementation. All of this data is going through a data layer anyway, and it's going through a tag management system. So you should be able to automatically validate that the data going through your data layer is matching the specifications that were produced by the analytics management system. And you should just be alerted if there's anything that's broken. And more importantly, one of the problems I've had with data validation in the last 20 years is that executives don't generally care about it because it doesn't affect them. They don't care if EVAR 10 is broken or Goal 5 is broken. What they care about is, can they answer the business questions that they need, or can you answer the questions that they need? But the problem is that they don't see the connection between the data that's broken at the lowest level and their business questions. But the cool part is analytics management systems see the relationship all the way from the business requirement down to the individual data layer elements, so that if there is something broken with a particular data layer element, they can relationally show you which business questions cannot be answered, and that can get get on the radar of your executives, and then finally they'll care about data quality. But that's really difficult to do with a non-integrated system of spreadsheets and Word documents, and if you're using different vendors for different parts of your implementation management. Another thing that's annoying is setting up those variables we talked about in your analytics tool. And that's silly. It's 2020. We shouldn't have to be manually setting up variables. So one of the cool things that you should be able to do is lean on an analytics management system, as you're seeing here, to be able to literally pick a data set, push a button, and have all of the variables and all the settings with those variables set up for you automatically. Because the analytics management system knows the solution design, it knows what variables are needed, and it even knows what configuration should be needed. And here I'm showing examples of Adobe. The same thing works with Google Analytics and eventually other vendors as well. But setting up these variables by hand should be a thing of the past. And then another part of your implementation that takes time to set up is like conversion metrics. A lot of people don't know what conversion metrics are available, but if you had a library of best practice conversion metrics that showed you which ones you can and cannot currently use based on what you have in your implementation, this would push people to say, I'm going to work backwards. I'm going to take the conversion metric I want, and I'm going to back into all of the different elements I need in order to have that conversion metric. And here on the screen, what you see is someone selecting a metric in an analytics management system and then pushing that metric into their analytics tool so all their users can use it. And the same thing can be done with automated dashboards. You should be able to automatically create dashboards, whether that's an analysis workspace or if that's in, whatever big, data's, the query tools that Google has, or the interfaces, to basically get right to the reports that you need and customize those for the business requirements. But the end goal is to not have to rely on all of these hodgepodge of systems and documents, when all of these things really should be interrelated so that you can push buttons and use the APIs and automation that is available these days to manage your implementation and make sure that your implementation is always documented, and reduce the risk that something was missed at any of those key steps that we talked about earlier. And so in a summary, like, these are the features that I think are the future. And just like when tag management came out, there were a lot of things people were doing by hand that have now been automated, but there's so much more that we're still doing by hand that we never got to. And if you look at this list, business requirements, making solution designs, making data layers, tagging specs, setting up tag management system, it's kind of like tag management took us one step, but it left 8 more steps that we didn't do, and we're just kind of learned to live with it. So this is why I think the way we've been doing it is just got to change. And then the last thing I want to leave you with is kind of pontificating about the future. And this is really kind of more 5 years out, but I've always been a little bit of a dreamer here. And so what would happen if we extrapolated this out to the future? What could happen for our whole industry? And the DAA is always focused on what is the future and what's big and can change our industry. So I want to share a couple ideas that I have. In the future, if analytics management systems ended up being pervasive, obviously, as we talked about today, organizations will be able to spend more time using data and less time implementing, which has plagued us for a long time. But more importantly, imagine different organizations all using a common set of business requirements that would finally get us, instead of having thousands of different implementations, we now have different organizations that are agreeing that not every implementation is going to be identical, but there is a lot of overlap. And Nike and Adidas they probably have similar websites, so you would expect that they're going to have a huge overlap in the requirements. And why should they be reinventing the wheel each time? Why can't they leverage some of the same requirements and then differentiate where they think they can have a competitive advantage? And if you do that, then that what means is that you can now share best practices or templates across the industry. Many of you have heard of the DAA cookbook that I helped start for the DAA, which is a bunch of recipes that say, here's a cool implementation you can do for visitor engagement or cross-sell. But the problem is those cookbook recipes are cool, but they're really hard to implement across companies. But if 10 different companies all had the same system, and they all said, I want to do cross-sell, and there's a recipe in the DA cookbook, and they were all on the same analytics management system, in theory, a couple of years from now, they would be able to push a button and be able to leverage the exact DAA cookbook recipe regardless of their implementation skills. The other thing that's really powerful about this is, if you think about it, business requirements then relate to everything else. So we could see which business requirements or business questions are really popular by country, by organization type, by region, by industry vertical. And we could start to assemble best practices as a whole industry, a digital analytics industry. Maybe if you work at a small company, there's a bunch of business requirements that are really relevant to you. But if you work at a huge company, it's different. And maybe if you're at a huge financial services company, there's a standard set of business requirements that everyone does that you could just know about and you could use to make sure that you're doing the 80-20 rule. But the one that I'm most excited about is this. Imagine that you are a customer and you're at a Google conference or an Adobe summit, and someone gets up there and says, hey, I'm using business requirement 142 or whatever, and I just created this really cool dashboard, a really cool calculated metric, and I took the data for this requirement and fed it out and wrote a really cool machine learning algorithm. And I'm such a nice person, I'm going to put this up on GitHub so you could all use it. That would never happen today because everyone has different implementations. But imagine if we could share dashboards, metrics, segments, algorithms. This is how we as an industry really can elevate to the next level. And I'm not saying for everything, but the 80-20 rule, as I said, about 75% of implementations are the same. So why don't we take the 50 to 75% and just agree that we all have the same business questions so that we can then share all of these dashboards, analyses, and so on. The other benefit of analytics management systems and this standardization is that right now, if you're not a tool expert, you're somewhat limited in what you can do in terms of implementation. But as I showed earlier, if you use an analytics management system, you can just check off requirements and the solution is done for you, which means that anyone can get into our field and you don't have to be limited because you don't want to become a guru on EVARs and SPROPs, which has kind of held a lot of people back. And then lastly, if you do it the right way and you focus more on business requirements, then you should be able to switch vendors anytime you want. You should be able to push a button and just say, you know what, I'm going to have my tag management system move my Adobe to Google, my Google to Adobe, because I'm really focused on the business questions, and I'm going to trust that the analytics management system will take care of the implementation part. And it would all be using the same data layer elements, so it wouldn't even, in theory, require any different tagging. So I think the way I'll leave this with you is, if you were to ask yourself, if you were to do a new analytics implementation today, would you do it without using a tag management system? Probably not, because that would be crazy. I mean, why would you do all the manual work when a tag management system can automate that and simplify that? But if that's the case, then I do think you have to ask yourself, as an industry, why are we all not doing the rest of it? Why are we not integrating and automating all of the other parts of the implementation that are equally as important? Because we're not, and we should be, and we could be. So that's my kind of soapbox speech on why I think we need a paradigm shift in this industry. And so I'll leave my information up here if you have questions, but we'll open it up for questions.
Well, if we don't have anything else, everyone else can feel free to drop. Thanks so much for attending. Thanks again, Adam, for that wonderful presentation.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
All right,